third in our series of lunchtime authors. We've had a wonderful response to the other two, and this is sort of the grand finale for the time being. This is the pièce de résistance. We have a lot of guests here, a lot of scholars, a lot of people interested from Jewish and Christian communities. I met Rabbi David Zaslow many years ago, but I think I met his wife before. His wife, yes. Deborah Gordon Zaslow, I met even longer ago at a storytelling festival. Deborah and I share last name of our birth, of Gordon, but we're not related, but we're related as brothers and sisters of storytelling. And I took a course with Rabbi Zaslow that he taught at, I think it was at a Kala, of a previous book that was similar, Roots and Branches, it was called, that was similar to this, but focused much more on Christianity as a religion. This book is focused more on Jesus the person, Jesus the Jew, and as one of our speakers recently, Rabbi Rami Shapiro, talks about, as Jesus, Judaism is the religion of Jesus, and Christianity is the religion about Jesus. So it'll be interesting to hear Rabbi Zaslow's reactions to all of that. We also happen to have a sponsor for this event. Mike Stark has graciously made a donation toward this event. So anybody else who's interested in sponsoring anything, we would love to honor you by honoring us. So we have enough time to learn as much as we can. Rabbi David Zaslow, the spiritual leader of Havurah Shir, Hadash, which means singing a new song. He's a man filled with song. I also want to mention he was at Temple Beth Torah many years ago when he was touring with what was called the Aleph Caravan, teaching people about Jewish renewal. And he came and he helped lead a Friday night service that had as much spirit as anything. So I'm delighted to share everything with my dear friend, Rabbi David Zaslow, teaching us about his book.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Dan. It's just such an honor to be here, even in this format of Zoom. I'd rather be there in person with you, but it's really, really an honor. I've been doing this interfaith work for 35, 40 years now. When I moved to Ashland, Oregon, which is a small city, the Jews for Jesus movement was in full bloom, and evangelical Christians heard that there was a new Jewish guy in town and swarmed on me. So with the swarms between Messianic Jews and the evangelicals who were really concerned about my soul, they were challenging my state of salvation. They were challenging me as a Jew and wanted me to have eternal life by accepting Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And they would question me and ask me questions, and I realized that they knew more about the prophetic tradition in Judaism leading to the idea of a Mashiach, of a Messiah, than I did. So I was really challenged to start studying very intensively in order to be able to give rational and respectful responses, because these were people who really cared and were really very, 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 very sincere in their evangelical pursuits. So what came out of that was my first book called Roots and Branches, which, as Rabbi Dan was saying, is really response to Christians asking questions like, how can Jews be saved since the temple was destroyed and there's no blood sacrifices? How can there be salvation without shedding of blood, etc.? And they were asking questions that on the surface were very, we could say, well, that's foolish questions, but really was coming from a very sincere place and rooted in evangelical theology. So they deserved a response. So my first book, Roots and Branches, did that. The second book, which I'm sharing parts of with you today, called Jesus, First Century Rabbi, as Rabbi Dan was saying, it's really more about the personage of Jesus as a rabbi. And with all my research, it's just so absolutely clear how both people from both traditions, Judaism and Christianity, are sort of missing the same boat. We're missing the same boat that Jesus was a religious Jew. As a religious Jew, he was not trying to start a new religion. He's not trying to convert anybody to Christianity. And certainly what happens is with the concept of replacement theology, we have ideas about Jesus that are Christological in basis, For example, his name wasn't Jesus, right? His name was Yehoshua or Joshua. His mother's name was not Mary, it was Miriam. So when he got called up to the Torah and he went to the synagogue regularly because he was part of the synagogue community, he would have been called up for an aliyah, coming up to the Torah for an honor, as Yehoshua ben Yosef, Joseph, then Miriam. So when we bring back his Hebraic context, when we bring back his Judaic roots, living in Judea, the nation of Judea, ancient Israel, we start to see a whole different picture. And especially as we start to study the Christian scriptures, we realize that many of our Christian brothers and sisters are studying it out of its cultural context. So that's what my presentation is today all about, is historical correction and bringing back context. So I'm going to start. I'm going to try to do too much today. So you'll pardon me. I'm not going to be I'm going to be doing some a couple of slideshow shares, and I'm not going to be staying too long on each one. This is really I decided to give a talk based upon a 4-part seminar. If anybody is interested in taking my seminar, I don't have dates yet. Ayla Zanenschein, who's here with us today, and I will figure out a date and we'll do the 4-part seminar. You'll have my email address, shalomrav, SHALOMRAV, at AOL.com. Maybe Ayla, if you wouldn't mind typing that into the chat, that would really, really be great. Shalom Rav, and just let me know if you're interested in a 4-part seminar, and I'll let you know where it is. So I think I'm going to do a screen share first, and just kind of take you on a little bit of a journey here. If you
anyone who wants Rabbi David's information, who doesn't remember that, can contact me, and I'll get it to you.
Thank you. So first of all, the thesis of my book is that there is a divine plan, and it's not us versus them. It's not ecclesia versus the synagogue, that all of us, from a more progressive point of view, are part of God's plan. And this has to do with patronizing. Jews and Christians both believe they have the truth. Christians have something, a great commission to accept Christ as Lord. I shouldn't say Christians, because there's so many denominations in Judaism and Christianity. There are really many Judaisms, and there are really many Christianities. And so evangelical Christians certainly have this notion that unless you accept Jesus as the Lord, there's no salvation. And Jews, of course, respond defensively with the idea that Jesus is not really God. Now, some of my teachers are Amy Jill Levine, a very important book, The Misunderstood Jew. I can't recommend this book enough to you. I mean, I'd like to say my book is more important, but no, she's really the master. She's an incredible teacher. She also wrote a book called The Jewish Annotated New Testament. All the top Jewish and Christian, all the top Jewish scholars in the country from every university annotating for the first time in history the Christian scriptures, the New Testament. It's an amazing book if you have a pastor friend to give them as a gift for Christmas, because it really does Jewish commentary on the New Testament. When we bring Jesus back into his historical context, we see that he taught in synagogues. So in Matthew 4:23, and Jesus went all about Galilee, teaching in their synagogues. Now you see already we have a problem with language. Teaching in their synagogues seems to put him outside of the synagogue life, out of Judaism, their synagogues, as if it's not his synagogue. But I'll give you an example. When I came to Rabbi Dan's synagogue, I didn't just walk in and start teaching. Rabbi Dan had to invite me, and I had to accept being invited. So when I came into the synagogue, I was a franchised guest teacher, just like I am today. So we have to read between the lines. When it says Jesus went about Galilee teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, when you read this in context, historical context, that he was an invited guest most likely in these synagogues, you have a whole different sense of him. Rather than preaching the gospel, meaning teaching Christianity about the kingdom, he was really teaching something that was a Jewish gospel. He was teaching aspects of the Torah and the kingdom of God and peace on earth, and that was the messianic hopes that were about at that time in the first century. Healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. This is what was expected of certain miracle workers. Jesus was in the tradition of Elijah and Elisha in terms of all the miracles that he performed. But when you just read things in context and not out of context, by teaching in the synagogues, you realize he was a franchised member of this, part of the synagogue. Jesus was respected in the synagogues. In the book of Mark, and behold, there comes one of the rulers of the synagogues, Jairus by name, and we saw him, meaning Jesus, meaning Joshua, he fell at his feet. Meaning that's a pretty respectful thing to do when you find a teacher to fall at a person's feet. So we bring this back into the context and realize how respected at least he was in this synagogue. Now, here's another one. Jesus chants the words of Isaiah in the synagogue. In other words, as those of you who are part of the synagogue know, that if you go to a Shabbat service, there's something called the Havurah, which is some readings usually from the prophets that complement the portion of the week. But in Luke 4:16, he came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and as his custom was, he went up to the synagogue on Shabbos, and he stood up to read. Now, Rabbi Dan knows, I don't walk into a synagogue and stand up and start reading the book of Isaiah, or any of the prophetic teachings. I have to be invited. So when it says he came to the synagogue on Shabbos, as was his custom, meaning he was kind of a regular member, probably paid his dues, got a dues he got a pledge letter, he had a board of directors, but he was invited to come to the synagogue to read. So when we put things in context, we realize that Jesus was not outside of the synagogue life, but very much part of it. Joshua, supports the Jewish commandments of the Torah. Think not, he says in book of Matthew, that I come to destroy the Torah or the prophets. I come not to destroy, but to fulfill. Now the word fulfill, the problem is that with replacement theology, the concept of fulfill means I want to complete it, fulfill it. What it means in the Greek, when you read the translation, fulfill means to properly interpret. So when Rabbi Dan or anybody in his synagogue gives a Devar Torah, a teaching, they don't come to destroy, but to properly interpret. So it's extremely important when we're reading the scriptures, especially the Hebrew scriptures, is to always go back to the original language and see what it meant. Certainly it's true when you go back to the Greek New Testament, is certainly you're one language or two languages away from Jesus, because Jesus may or may not have spoken Greek, but certainly the only New Testaments that we've got are in Greek, and they're describing a people who spoke on the street Aramaic and Hebrew in the synagogue. So Jesus instructs his followers to bring offerings to the temple. Show thyself to thy priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for testimony for them. In other words, the temple system before the temple was destroyed was a system of offerings. He was not only not against that, he went to the temple regularly himself. He upheld the nature of Torah. Even if heaven and earth shall pass, the word of Moses and of the other prophets shall not pass. There was no notion of replacement theology at that time. There was no notion of Christianity in the first century. He was very much a religious Jew living in the context. Now, I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. I'm not going to read all the scriptures, but Jesus was circumcised himself at 8 days old. He lived a very religious Jewish life. It would be, of course, distinguishable from modern Jewish life, but in some key elements it was not distinguishable. Mary, his mother named Miriam, after she gave birth, she went to the mikvah. She went to the bathing pool for immersion, as is done in traditional Judaism to this very day. That 30 days after the birth of a child, you go to the mikvah, or after the menstrual period. So Miriam, of course, living a very Jewish life. When you read the context and you don't pass these verses by quickly, you slow it down, you realize, for example, in John, it says it was the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah. It doesn't say Hanukkah in the Christian scriptures, it just says Feast of Dedication, and Jesus was walking in the temple. So for the fact that he goes to the temple in Jerusalem on Hanukkah is just showing his very much profound connection to his Jewish faith. Now, here's really fascinating. A lot of our Christian friends, liberal denominations, conservative denominations, it really doesn't matter, take his beautiful words, his powerful words, his beautiful parables. Rabbi Dan would recognize them. Jesus was a storyteller. He was a Magid. And as a storyteller, his parables are unbelievable. Probably in our tradition, I can't think of a Magid more profound than Yehoshua ben Yosef and Miriam, than Jesus. Really profound. But when he's speaking, when you read his words in the Christian scriptures, he's very often showing you his link to the early stages, the early years of rabbinic Judaism of his time. For example, he in the book of Matthew, he teaches about atonement. If you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave the gift there in front of the altar. First go to be reconciled with your brother and then come offer your gift. So many of my Christian friends think, oh, this really shows the grace of Jesus and of Christianity. And it's true, but it comes exactly out of the Jewish tradition. As Rabbi Dan and any other rabbi will tell you, from the Talmud, the teaching is, for a person's transgression against his neighbor, the Day of Atonement does not procure forgiveness until he is conciliated with his neighbor. The same thing with Shabbat. So Jesus says in the book of Mark, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. This sounds so wonderful. It's full of grace, but it really is coming right out of the Jewish tradition, where it says the Sabbath is committed to your hands, not you to his hands. So I just want to say this with all love and respect for our sister religion, Christianity, that when you're reading the words of Jesus, very often he's quoting either from the Bible, from the Tanakh, or from the Torah. His favorite quotes are from the book of Isaiah. He doesn't put footnotes on it. He just does the quote because most people understood Isaiah. But often when he's teaching from the oral tradition at the time. Right? Measure for measure. Matthew, Jesus says, judge not that you will be judged. For with that judgment that you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured against you. This is exactly out of the oral Torah. The Talmud, it teaches, our rabbis taught, he who judges his neighbor favorably is himself judged favorably. Measure for measure, what we call midah keneged midah. One of the most important ones is what's called the golden rule. So Christians see this beautiful teaching in Matthew. Therefore, all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. For this is the law, the Torah, and the prophets. Gorgeous, fantastic. I love it. It's great. What's challenging is that if a Christian friend thinks that Jesus was teaching grace and Judaism is left with the harshness of the law, but his teaching came right out of probably what was one of his teachers who was alive, extant during the time of Jesus' life, and it was Rabbi Hillel, who taught, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary thereof. So Jesus is most likely here quoting from the oral tradition of his day and age. He was part of that oral tradition. You realize spiritual laborers. I'm not going to just go through every single one of these, but some of these are just gems. Jesus teaches. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send our laborers into his harvest, his harvest. And it comes right out of the Talmud in Pirkei Avot. The day is short, the work is great, the laborers are lazy, the reward is great, and the master of the house is insistent. Faithful is your employer, and pay you the reward of your labor. In other words, the metaphors that Jesus is using are rooted in the oral Torah. Now, I will have to say that when his parables come about, I can't think of anybody, Rabbi Dan, who taught parables or gave parables or had storytelling to the depth that this teacher has. I mean, wow, would I have taken his Magi training class? You know, I would have signed up, even if it was on Zoom. So Jesus' teaching says, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And that really comes out of one of our midrashic teachings. Love and humility. I don't have to read all of these to you. But you could see, for example, in the concept of love, in the book of Mark, and to love God, him, with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your soul, with all your strength. What is he doing? He doesn't say, I am now quoting Deuteronomy 6:5, but he was quoting right from his Torah, not their Torah, but his Torah. And And what does it say in Deuteronomy 6:5? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. It's pretty incredible. When you read the words of Jesus in their historical context, you realize you've got an amazing Jew. You've got an amazing rabbi, an amazing teacher. And I just have to say, as a challenge to my Jewish brothers and sisters, I hope that over the decades we can reclaim him. You know, if we don't reclaim him as Messiah, we reclaim him as teacher. We reclaim him as one of our teachers. So I want to take a break for just a few minutes. I've got another little slideshow I'm going to share with you that's a little more challenging, but I want you to, Rabbi Jay, hi, how are you? Good to see you, man. So if anybody has any questions, just wave your hand up so I can see who it is, and we'll just pause for a few minutes. And
or if you don't want to interrupt verbally or are shy and want to chat in a question, that's okay too.
Thank you. The chat is at the bottom in the middle, so you could just type in a question or raise your hand if you'd like to. Anybody? Yes, please, Mike Kahn. Why don't you unmute? Unmute, holy brother. Thank you.
Rabbi, I have a question about your quotations from the Talmud to compare with the New Testament. But I mean, from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, the Talmud was written later on. Doesn't the New Testament predate the Talmud?
Yes and no. It's very, very interesting. The two texts were really the Talmud was compiled hundreds of years after the first century. In the middle of the 300s, the Mishnah was compiled, but it had been written or collected from hundreds of years before the Common Era. So from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when we started collecting the teachings of what we call the Oral Torah, collecting our parables and our stories, we were writing them down, but we never edited them until the 3rd century. So that's the historical reality. Now, in a way, it's fascinating, Mike, is that Judaism and Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism of Rabbi Jay and Rabbi Dan and myself and any other rabbis who may be here that I don't know, were really born at the same time. Rabbinic Judaism was born out of the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Christianity was born out of the crucifixion. It's fascinating that the crucifixion took place just outside of the temple walls. They were like within a few hundred meters of each other. These two religions formed simultaneously. Remember, Rabbinic Judaism was an evolutionary development for survival out of Temple Judaism. So what was happening in the 1st century when Jesus was teaching is that he was part of this new development called the new paradigm of Judaism that was being developed. And he was very, very much part of that. When you read the historical record, read historian scholars such as Amy Jill Levine and others. But yes, you're absolutely right. Historically, the compilation or the publication of the Talmud took place hundreds of years after the 1st century. But also the compilation of the New Testament also took place, much later as well. Go ahead, Rabbi.
So right. So part of it, and I'm so proud of Mike for knowing that, but part of it is that the conversations were taking place. Both the conversations about neither the New Testament nor the Talmud were written during his lifetime, but those conversations were ongoing. A question came up in the chat room, and it's something that I remember reading from your book in terms of what group of Jews Jesus might have affiliated with. Because I remember as a youngster, I was taught that Jesus was likely part of the Essenes, but in your book you talk about him more likely connected with Pharisees.
Yeah, I want to say this. I'm not a scholar. I'm kind of like what they call an evangelist or a magi, the storyteller. I really relied on all the top scholarship of all the top scholars in the country. Amy Jill Levine being my hero and sort of the main mentor. An amazing Vanderbilt University New Testament, Orthodox Jewish feminist, New Testament scholar, unbelievable writing.
I have heard. I've been part of presentations that she's given to.
Pretty incredible, right, Rabbi Dan? So it's not just me saying it as a little storyteller here. Jesus's teachings are right in line with the more lenient teachings of Hillel and Rabbi Akiva in the rabbinic Pharisaic tradition. He wasn't per se, I'm a card-carrying member of the Pharisees, but his teachings, he had a unique little branch. Remember, there were dozens of sects at the time of the first century, just like we have Reform and Reconstructionist and Renewal and Conservative and Orthodox and all these different branches. There were also different sects or branches at that particular time. It's likely that he was, not likely, it's almost certain that he had contact with the Essenes. He may have gone on retreats with the Essenes at the Essene Retreat Center, but he was not per se an overt mystic in the sense of the way the Essenes were, who separated themselves out from the community. Jesus was very much in the Pharisaic tradition. Thank you, Dan.
And can you define for people who aren't as familiar who the Pharisees were?
Well, the Pharisees, just in a very, standing on one foot in a very broad sense, is that when you see rabbinic Judaism today, when you take a class with Rabbi Jay or Rabbi Dan or myself, you are seeing a version of Pharisaic Judaism. In other words, it is the Judaism of after the destruction of the temple, who these people were saying that you don't have to bring a physical offering to a temple, that we can bring the offerings of our lips, the words of our lips. They retranslated an offering system located in space in Jerusalem to the system of prayer that we know today. These were the Pharisees. When you read the Talmud, you read the dialogue between them, between the different rabbis. That's Pharisaic Judaism. It's the Judaism of dialogue, the Judaism of God wrestling, the Judaism of not getting locked into a dogma, but really being more locked into the dialogue.
And when leadership had more to do with learning and teaching than it did with the heredity of the priesthood.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was a big shift. I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Sadducees and the priesthood to the Pharisees, but rabbinic Judaism really grew out of the Pharisaic movement, which was, so to speak, the progressive, cutting-edge renewal, reconstruction, reform of its particular day and age. Anybody else have any questions? I think I'll go on to part 2, if that's okay, Rabbi Dan.
Please.
So this is a little more challenging, because I think in our day and age, I decided to put this in, and it's very, very important, and I really want to do this with total respect. So my rabbi, Zalman Shalom Shalomi, may rest in peace, Alav Shalom, did unbelievable work, especially with Catholics, and interfaith work with Native Americans and Buddhists throughout his lifetime. But he was doing it even before Vatican II Council in the Catholic Church. You have to remember the great work of the Church has been to redeem itself from its own prejudices about Judaism. So that replacement theology says there is a New Testament that replaces the Old Testament, new and old. So Reb Zalman came up with the terms elder and younger. So he calls the New Testament the Younger Testament, and as elder and younger are respectful in both directions, where old and new is like, would you like to have a new book or the old book? I think I'll take the new one. So it's just an amazing little mental shift. So he was doing work like, for example, with Thomas Merton in the 50s, taking his retreats in the early 60s at Gethsemane, doing unbelievable radical interfaith work. Wouldn't be so radical today, but he sat with Merton at Gethsemane in the Trappist monastery. He was chanting Tehillim, Psalms in Hebrew, while Merton was chanting them in Latin. They were doing it simultaneously. This was in the early 60s. Amazing, amazing work going on. But you have to understand, this was just before Vatican II declared that the Jews indeed were not going to hell, but had a place in God's kingdom. This seems crazy to us that this would be such a radical move, but God bless the Catholic Church for coming out with such a document as the Second Vatican II Council papers. Very, very, very courageous. So the remnants of, just like we see with the issue of Confederate statues going on in the United States, the issue still exists in Europe. When I show you some of the pictures in just a moment of some of the stained glass windows, some of the reliefs, some of the statuary in Europe, which depict the Jews in a horrible manner, you won't believe that these still exist, but they do still exist. And so I decided to share this with you today because it's important to have a grasp, just as our country is deciding what to do with all the statuary of Confederate generals and really challenging. Listen, I grew up in New York City. I went to the Natural Museum and saw, Teddy Roosevelt with a Native American and a free black slave standing lowered next to him. I went past it 100 times in my lifetime and it didn't even click into my brain, but it affected my subconscious. When you have a statue like that showing the subservience of black people and Native Americans to the grand Teddy Roosevelt, what do you do with the statue? I don't know, but I'm just saying I understand how disturbing it is if you're an African American. Just like some of the things I'm going to share with you now are very disturbing to us as Jews when we see them throughout Europe. So let me just share these with you. And then
as you're getting that screen up, I just want to welcome, in addition to the rabbis and clergy, your cousin from Ashland and Rabbi Jay, Reverend Steve Quill is here from the Lutheran Church. And
fantastic. Thank you.
Logged in.
So any of the pastors also, this is just challenging stuff. So I just want to say I'm sharing it with total respect for historical correction. This is not like one-upmanship in any way whatsoever. The restoration of Jesus to his Jewishness will enhance the Lutheran Church. It will enhance Judaism. So we all have our work to do within our own communities. So when we take a look at Jesus, we have to say, will the real Jesus please stand? Which is our image of Jesus? Whether it's the Eastern Church on the left, or the European Church, the Protestant churches on the right, or do we depict him as a Jew? And probably not even that depiction in the middle is so good, because he would have been an olive-skinned Mediterranean man, but he certainly would have been. He would look more like the character in the middle than he would have. And these are just depictions, but they affect our conscious way of how we understand Christianity. I want to share with you Rembrandt's amazing picture of the binding of Isaac, because to understand Christianity, you really have to understand the story of Isaac, the binding of Isaac, the relationship between the father and the son, a father that would take his son's life. To understand the story and the roots of Christianity, please study Isaac, study the different traditions in Isaac. And any of the pastors here, I just want to say, if you write to me offline, I will be glad to send you as a gift a copy of this book, Roots and Branches, which goes through the story of the binding of Isaac and its roots within Christianity. It's an amazing comparison that I just can't do justice today. But the relationship between father and son, between Jesus and our Heavenly Father, is very parallel to the story of Isaac and Abraham. So this is the book published by Paraclete Press. You're welcome to write me. I'll be glad to send you a copy. Go on Amazon or directly to Paraclete Press. Now I sound like I'm doing an infomercial here, but this is a word from our sponsor. So this really breaks out all the teachings that I've been sharing today in much greater detail. I followed it up with the story called Reimagining Exodus, which is really the parallel story between Easter and Pesach, the story of our liberation from slavery and the story of the resurrection after Good Friday. I was telling an Episcopal priest friend of mine that, wow, this is really amazing, but the word for exile and the word for redemption and the word for revelation all have the same root, a Gimel Lamed root for those of you who know Hebrew. So Galut, Geula, and Galui, exile, redemption, and then revelation relate to our stories of being enslaved, being freed, and then going to Mount Sinai and having a revelation. And she turned to me and said, well, it's the same in Christianity. Good Friday is our exile. Sunday morning Easter is our redemption. And then we also count 50 days to Pentecost, which is our revelation. So it's really fascinating when we take a look at the parallels between our faith traditions, how much more in common we have than it separates us. So here's replacement theology. I'm sparing you the beautiful naked body of Michelangelo. But one thing that replacement theology does is it works on the unconscious in a very subtle way. But if those of you who've seen Michelangelo's King David, the first thing, if you're Jewish, that you notice about King David is what? The dude is not circumcised, right? So in other words, Michelangelo created a beautiful genitalia of King David as really being like a, you know, I love Italy, right? So he was a good Italian. He wasn't circumcised. And this subtlety of the images goes into a little bit more dangerous territory when Christian artists like Michelangelo don't know the Hebrew and they depict Moses. This is not anti-Semitic, but boy, was it used by anti-Semites. You'll take a look at his head and look what he's got on his top of his head. He's got two horns. This is Moses. Because the word for horn in Hebrew and the word for radiant aura of light, spikes of light, rays of light, it comes from the same root. In other words, the root for the word for rays of light is really a metaphor, horns of light. But Michelangelo took it depicted literally. I grew up in Brooklyn with a lot of Irish Catholic kids and Italian Catholic kids, and I'm telling you, I knew an Italian Catholic kid. He really was told by his grandmother that the Jews had horns. And the problem with that is, of course, the horns are associated with the devil. I don't think Michelangelo intended that, but that's the way it was used, and that's the way everybody in Italy who saw this beautiful sculpture of Moses thought of the Jews as having horns. Now, this is an amazing painting because you see, again, in the parallel birth stories of Jesus and Moses, you can hardly tell who this is. Who's the baby? Is it baby Jesus or is it baby Moses? Well, this happens to be, well, you guess, right? The stories are very, very parallel. When you take a look at the birth stories are really, really pretty incredible parallel stories in their lives. Now, here's where we get into challenges, and this is where I really want to be very, very delicate and very respectful. Throughout Europe, in 40 or 50 different locations, from England to France to the most vile versions are in Germany, are depictions of a form of art. You can Google it after our class today, called ecclesia, which means church, and synagogue, or synagogia, which means synagogue. You can see that this is a very interesting depiction. Synagogue on the right has the book of the Torah sliding out of her hands. She's blindfolded, she's bent over, where ecclesia is holding the chalice, she's holding the cross, and she's triumphant queen. So we have a depiction of Christianity and Judaism on the relief of Strasbourg Cathedral from the 13th century that is really depicting the replacement of the church over the synagogue. This is not unusual, by the way. They were all throughout Europe. It becomes more vile in the depictions of the Judaism when you see in German churches. So this is a pig. It's kind of worn out by time. And these are Jews suckling or nursing from the pig, from the swine. This is called Judensau, Jew pig. The Judensau depictions that are all through. Now, you'll really pardon me because the Lutheran Church has done so much good work in the United States and in Germany in repenting for the anti-Semitism of Martin Luther. But Martin Luther was a genius. His teachings are extraordinary. In his reformation of Catholicism to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, along with Calvin, he did more to change the church for the good in the same way that his Reformation inspired the liberalization of Judaism as well. But towards the end of his life, maybe it was a mental illness or paranoia, really pardon me, Reverend, but he was really one of the most vile anti-Semites towards the end of his life. So this is a book that he wrote, that he put out, and it shows the Jews suckling or nursing from the pig. His depictions of the Jews, his writings about the Jews are some of the worst that's ever been written. You see these depictions in St. John's Church in Germany as well. You could see the synagogue on the right riding on a goat with the head of a goat in his hand, the crown, the sword of God thrust through synagogue's head, and on the left the triumphant ecclesia, the triumphant church, writing on the tetramorph of the book of Ezekiel. So this depiction, remember, people were, there was a lot of illiteracy then, so the stained glass windows were not just, oh, that's a pretty decor. It was telling a story. And it was telling a story that Christianity is triumphant over Judaism. The suffering servant. I'm not going to study this academically because I really want to leave some time for dialogue. But the servant, if you read the book of Isaiah from chapter 41 to 49, you realize that Israel, the Jewish people, are the suffering servant who suffers so that the world might be free, who suffered so that would be a model for that. For example, when we say never again, a Holocaust occurs, that the horror that happened to the Jewish people would be a model for what should never happen in the world. So that the issue of the servant is written about as is Judaism, but when you read some Christian commentary, especially from replacement theologians, that in Isaiah 49 and Isaiah 53 and 54, the suffering servant turns to Jesus. Jesus becomes the servant. Jesus was a suffering servant, but it didn't replace the the Jewish people. So here's really fascinating because it so much relates to what's going on in our country. We don't know what to do with these statues. Well, if you're a white person, you have a whole different perspective. My son-in-law is African American, grew up in Florida. He's a professor of philosophy in Richmond, Virginia. Well, his perspective when he walks by a statue of Robert E. Lee is very different than mine. So the statue of Robert E. Lee doesn't buzz me viscerally. It maybe buzzes me intellectually, where it buzzes him viscerally. Well, when I walk by a statue seeing Jews suckling from the backside and the teats of a pig, of a sow, well, it's disturbing. So this one is in Martin Luther's own church where he preached. And what's interesting is that this particular relief on his church in Wittenberg was taken off to be cleaned and restored a couple of years ago. But when it was placed back, there was such an uproar that should this statue even be existing? And according to German law, it had to be replaced because it's part of the history. So it's the same debate as going on in the United States, except with the church, Lutheran church in Germany decided to do creatively, says, well, we have to put it back, but we don't have to show it. So it is a beautiful article I just read last week. I don't know if any Rabbi Jay or Rabbi Dan read this article, but what the church decided to do was to put it back, but to cover it up. So I thought that was kind of a brilliant solution, because should this be depicted? Well, maybe it should be, but it really needs a big plaque saying that this church was part of the beginning of the modern anti-Semitic movement. So again, no aspersion about Lutheran theology, but certainly Martin Luther's life in the last few years, this was his church and his statue to him. I want to just move forward to, again, this idea of how rooted the words of Jesus are to the words of the tradition that he came from. So what I did is, every phrase that you read in the words of Jesus are rooted somewhere in Jewish tradition. So that if I read on the left side, who art in heaven, exalted and hallowed be thy great name. Thine is the kingdom, for heaven and earth are one dominion. Behold, you will rain bread from heaven, and the people shall go out and gather a certain portion every day. Every creditor that lends to his neighbor shall release his debts. The Lord will deliver us on the day of evil. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. This was not such a big stretch for me to discover. I wasn't pushing the scholarship to find out what Jesus might have been quoting from. But when Jesus says this beautiful prayer that's often called the Apostles' Prayer or the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. When Jesus would have said that, the language would have been so familiar that all the Jewish listeners remember there were no Presbyterians or Methodists then, right? His Jewish Talmidim, his Jewish followers, his Jewish Hasidim would have all said, Amen. They would have, because they would have understood the language, would have been familiar to them. The phrases would have been familiar to them. So we're going to be opening it up to questions in a moment, but I just wanted to end with, when I'm doing something so heavy, I wanted to do something a little bit lighter. So I don't think any more needs to be said than this, but I thought it was pretty cute. Another one. Okay. This is really for Oregon. I don't know what it's like in Texas, Rabbi Dan, but if we had wine and fish, people would ask, is it gluten-free?
We would just make a filter.
You would just make a filter. Okay, good. So if you want to write this down, check out my website. Write me at shalomrav@aol.com. If you'd like to be part of the seminar, the 4-part seminar on the first century Jesus. I obviously had to rush through things so much today to be able to get this in, so I hope you'll forgive me for going a little bit too fast. But I'm from New York, so this is sort of normal speed.
Yes. So wonderful. I'm sure there's lots of questions. There's and one of the other ministers who wasn't able to come in today because of a conflict in our community, Reverend Kimberly Orr, wrote a book called The Chutzpah Gospels, which has a lot of these same kinds of things. One of the things that always comes to my mind in my work in interfaith communities is, and it seems that you tread this narrow bridge as well, how to maintain our respect for Jesus the teacher without deifying him and without sort of suggesting that those who do deify him are wrong. That was one of your first slides, saying, the misconceptions of we have the real truth. No, we have the real truth. I think I got this line from your book. If not, it was from something else. Is Jesus God or fraud?
Yeah, I wouldn't have quite said that. But what we do understand in the interfaith work that I do is that really there are two Jesuses, at least two. One is the historical Jesus, and that's who I'm speaking about. And the other one is the theological Jesus. So, for example, the theological Jesus to a Lutheran or to a Catholic is that Jesus is the incarnation of God, the Son of God, part of the deity, part of the Godhead, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. That is a theological position which is true within the church. The historical Jesus, the Jesus that you and I, Rabbi Dan, would have taken workshops with and gone to retreat centers with, was a religious Jew who was a son of God, as you are, as I am, as every one of us is a child of God. That's a term that's used throughout the Tanakh. We're all children of God. So I'm the son of God. You're the son of God. We're all sons and daughters. That's a historical position. So the historical Jesus is true, and the theological Jesus is true. It's just the thing that buzzes us is when the theological Jesus people say, this is the truth, the only truth, and nothing but the truth, and there's no salvation outside of Jesus. So that's the challenge. I don't think it's hard for me to hold the paradox that my Christian friends see the incarnation of Jesus.
To be able to say,
Zohar,
this is true for you, and this is true for me.
Exactly. And look, in a Zohar, in our mystical tradition, it says, Kucha bericho v'yoraita, Kucha bericho Yisrael v'yoraita chadhu. That it says God, Kucha berichu, Yisrael, the people of Israel, and the Torah, chadhu, are one. It's our Trinity. We also have a mystical tradition that says that God, the people, and the Torah are part of the Godhead, are one. So the incarnation is not a Christian concept. Incarnation is ultimately a Jewish concept. Exclusive incarnation, that Jesus is the only Son of God, that's not a Jewish concept. But what I'm saying is that Elu ve'elu, you could still have a historical Jesus, and you can have a theological Jesus, and they are side by side. Whether we like it or not, they're side by side. So it's time we started respecting each other's traditions. Please, David. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead if David has a question.
Yes, David Cooten here from Bend, Oregon. It's just so great to see Rabbi Zaslow. jovial and teaching, and we met him. As many people know, he served us very faithfully here in Central Oregon, and we look forward to bringing him back like the Shabbatones he used to do.
Thank you.
And the rabbi knows I'm involved in an interfaith marriage. I did something very unusual. I sent my son to a Catholic school, St. Francis, and even beyond that, had his bar mitzvah at St. Francis, and was probably the first non-Catholic to be asked to participate in Catholic confirmation. And that was a very awesome experience. Couple of comments I'd like to make. I served many years on the Interfaith Council and the Ben Ministerial Association. Couple of things about Martin Luther. As I understand it, he in the early part of his life, he had really hoped that the Jews were going to convert. Pretty much kind of like the Prophet Muhammad had hoped that the Jews were going to convert. But then later in life, when he saw that the Jews were not converting en masse, he was deeply disappointed.
That's correct, David. Yeah. We just don't know what happened because his early writings were so brilliant, so incredible in terms of the Reformation. So we don't really know what happened to him later in life, whether it was really a mental illness or not. But certainly the later Martin Luther, who was anti-Semitic, was different than the early one. Do you have a question? Because I want to get to some other people too. So.
No, just thank you.
Thank you, David. Good to see you.
So when you talk about shared traditions, Rabbi, I wonder how you feel. I have been to some Christian seders, Passover seders, where they are creating traditions, and some of my colleagues will say they stole that from us, and the Catholics use incense, and there's all kinds of Christian motifs, as you say, that have their roots in Judaism. How do you feel about that? I've come to the place where I say, no, it's not that they stole it from us. It's that we've shared it with them and they're using it in a different way. And yet I still have a little bit of discomfort with the ways they use it.
I think it's a great question. Page 93 in the book. So in all seriousness, here's the story. There is cultural appropriation. There is cultural appropriation where we take something from another culture. But do we credit it? Do we ascribe it? Do we footnote it and say we want to thank our Jewish brothers and sisters for this teaching? Usually not. Judaism has appropriated things from the Sufis, from Islamic mystics, from Christian mystics. Do we ascribe it? Usually not. So the question of appropriation is not should it be used, but how it's done. So for example, if we take a look at the communion and we take a look at the bread and the wine and the candle, we're realizing that's, so to speak, a variation or an appropriation of the Jewish Shabbat Kiddush service with the wine and the bread and the candles. Is it ascribed? Is it understood by most Christians? Rarely. So the job of the church, if they're going to do something, is to really give it its proper context and to ascribe it and to give honor from the elder tradition that it's from. I want to give you a little, very quick, it's not really a story, it's more of a Maisa. It's not a Maisa, really, it's a true story. But a Catholic priest friend of mine said to me, Rabbi David, I want to do a Catholic Seder. I wonder how you feel about that. And I said, Father Mike, I don't really feel so good about that because, it's an appropriation of a Jewish ritual. You've got Easter, it's really wonderful, it's beautiful, but we want to maintain certain distance between our unique religions. So I don't feel, what you want to do, Father Mike, is go to somebody in the Jewish community and invite them to lead a model Seder, a model Jewish Seder to show what Jesus' Seders would have been like. I think that's very appropriate, Father Mike. So just go to somebody in the Jewish community. He turned to me and he said, okay, Rabbi David, will you do it? Well, I'm telling you, every single year for the last 5 years, I've been doing model Seders at that particular Catholic church. Even year 2, the Mormons heard I was doing a model Seder, and they called me up and said, hey, do a model Seder for us too. I feel great about model Seders. I do not feel great about Christian Seders. I would feel good about it if the Seder was not an appropriation, but was also gave honor and respect for the roots that it came in. In other words, if your Christian friend, Rabbi Dan, invited you to be part of the Seder, to lead part of it, and gave honor to the Jewish roots of the Seder, maybe then I'd feel so good about it. But right now I really feel it's appropriate for us to do model Seders, how Jesus would. I do a Shabbat service called the Shabbat of Jesus, and I try to do a Friday night and a Saturday morning the way Jesus would have experienced it. It's very different than if the church simply appropriates one of our traditions.
That's a nice answer. At the Seder that I went to, they gave me the last word, Lashana Haba Yerushalayim, and I gave a little drush, but it was mostly a Christian Seder. This year, there's a church that we work very closely with that asked me to do exactly what you're saying, the model Seder in the Jewish way, but unfortunately got canceled due to COVID.
Yeah, the problem with the Seders that are done in the churches is that they're elements of replacement theology. In other words, the matzah, the stripes on the matzah, the stripes of Jesus' passion, the breaking of the matzah is the breaking of Jesus. You know, that's a beautiful application of the story, as long as you don't take away the brokenness of the Jewish people. In other words, if it's not an appropriation, but really an unpacking of the story applied to their lives.
Well, and absolutely, and not to spend too much time on it, but in this particular case, again, I was invited just to be an observer, and I was asked privately, how do you feel? And I said, there are things, because the things you're describing, we're all there. We're all part of it. Yeah. And they asked, how do I feel about it? And I said, well, this is your program. I'm uncomfortable with it, but I don't want you to tell me what to believe and how to practice.
Right. Yeah.
And so I don't feel comfortable telling you how to do it, but this is not how I would observe it.
Well, I'm much older than you, Dan, and so I feel I have less to risk and more risk to take. So when it comes to the passion story, and that's what I want to make an announcement right now. Any pastor who's with us here, if you write to me, I will send you this book for free as my gift, along with the other book, Roots and Branches, because that's my missionary outreach to bring the church and the synagogue closer together. I feel very passionate that the way the passion story on Good Friday is told in almost all churches is the distortion of the historical reality that's quotes in the book of John, quotes in the book of Matthew, that his blood be upon us and our children. These are problematic, and I can no longer sit back quietly. I really feel, with all due respect to my pastoral association, my interfaith group, I really try to preach that the Good Friday story needs to be changed. It needs to be tackled, that some of the texts are terror texts. And I have to deal with the terror texts in the book of Deuteronomy. Muslims have to deal with the terror texts in the Quran. So my job is to deal with some of the things that are disturbing in my tradition. Your job, to my Christian friends, is to say, you got to deal with that Good Friday story, because it perpetuates that the Jews handed Jesus over for crucifixion without a question in most of the texts. So I think that's very, very important for me personally. You know, I go pretty respectful and pretty frontal about it to my Christian friends.
Yeah, the irony was not lost. There's a church that when Houston experienced Hurricane Harvey, the place where we ordinarily hold our Passover Seder wasn't available, and there was a Methodist church that invited us to use their facility at no charge. Said, we're honored to have you, and the Seder, first night of Seder, was Good Friday. So they were in their sanctuary observing Good Friday, and I don't know if it was a passion play. I don't know how that observance was, while we were in their social hall having the Passover Seder, and it was a very ironic thing.
Yeah. In my book, Reimagining Exodus, I actually tell the story of almost a very similar story of how the synagogue that I was a visiting guest rabbi of, we did a combined Good Friday Shabbat together in a way that was totally appropriate to both religions. So because of time is a little limited.
Is that the one I think I've heard you tell the story where you held up your talit, but because of the lighting, it looked like you were on the cross? Yeah,
it did. Yeah. I'm afraid to even get near that story, but it's in the book Reimagining Exodus, and it was really an amazing moment for the Presbyterian Church and for us.
One more comment from Greg LaCour. Greg, can you unmute yourself. Greg is
Yes.
a Catholic born, married to a Jewish woman, and has been an active member of the synagogue for a very long time.
Hi, Greg.
Yeah. Hi, Rabbi. I just want to concur with your statements on the readings during Palm Sunday. As a Catholic, I find them completely inappropriate in today's context, or in any context when you look back at it. And I would strongly encourage anyone in the Christian perspective to reconsider using John's Gospel at all, period, in that kind of context.
Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate you saying that. We need people who've grown up in Christianity to really witness this. It's not just some crazy rabbi who's disturbed by the scriptures. I love Jesus' teachings. But when you get to the book of John, you're getting to some of the New Testament roots of anti-Semitism there.
That's right.
Very disturbing. So the Palm Sunday story, certainly the Good Friday story, the Passion story, really blame the Jews for the crucifixion. You know, many of us grew up as religious Jews and being called Christ killers, and we didn't even know where that term came from. But,
right.
It has to be confronted directly, in the same way that our black brothers and sisters are confronting the issue of these statues. These things, you could say it's part of German history or French history that it's on the churches. It may be part of your history, but it's hurt my people. And the book of John hurts my people every year. So what should be done with it? Better unpacking, retranslation, sharing it, but sharing it with great passion and zeal, how inaccurate and how much harm this has caused. It's a terror text, parts of it.
It is. I agree.
And I think part of what you're teaching is emphasizing, Rabbi Zaslow, Rabbi David, is sensitivity to the times is always important.
Very important.
That yeah. Jesus was in a place in history where Judaism was changing, and today we're in a place where Judaism is changing. We're always in a place where Judaism is changing. And that's why halakha comes from the word the path, the going, right? A movement.
And that's why I want to the social justice movement today. We're in a place where America is changing. I have a black son-in-law, so I'm extremely sensitized to systemic racism that I wasn't aware how deeply embedded it was in me. But when he walks by a statue and I walk by a statue, we both have different reactions to it. So my example is my grandparents came to America to be free. They came for freedom. His great-great-grandparents came to America from freedom and were enslaved. So we both love America the same way, but we both have different perspectives. Because to him, America was the place freedom was taken away from him. To me, from my grandparents, America was the place where freedom was given. So this creates a whole different mental attitude about these statues. Peter Stuyvesant was an anti-Semite. So, Stuyvesant High School was one of the great high schools in New York. I never paid any attention to it because New York or America was the place that franchised my people. Any other questions? I want to get some other people on before we have to finish today. Please, Deborah. Did you raise your hand? I'm not sure. No, okay.
So once again, I want to thank Rabbi David Zaslow for sharing such wonderful insight. People who want to know how to contact him privately can write to me if they've forgotten shalomrav@aol.com. I also want to thank Michael Stark for making a donation to sponsor today, and invite anybody who wants to help Temple Beth Torah, who really needs it, to offer up any kind of love offerings. We look forward to continue learning, continue interfaith dialogue. Shabbat, once again, will be Friday night on Zoom. And we're delighted that so many people were able to come on. I think we had close to 40 different computers. So
that's great. And Rabbi Dan, I want to emphasize what you're saying too. In this pandemic, everybody, synagogues, small synagogues that Rabbi Dan represents, that I represent, are really struggling in terms of fundraising. Please, if you're able to, make a donation to his synagogue. Rabbi Dan, if you could put down the email, well, everybody knows how to get a hold of you, I suppose, but if you want to put down the link or the email in chat for your synagogue. But I would love to see everybody make a small donation to your synagogue today in the merit of our learning together today.
Yes, we are www.tbthumble.org or TB Thumble, or you can Google Rabbi Dan Gordon, Houston, Texas, Humble, Texas. We are the only humble synagogue there is, and we try to remain humble.
That's great. And I want to put it out again that any pastor or minister who wants a copy of my books, this is just what I do. I just want to send it a gift copy for you or your church. I'm really honored to do that. So just get a hold of me at shalomrav@aol.com. So before we close, any final questions or final comments that you might not have gotten in? This would be the moment to do it. Otherwise, I just really want to thank you, Rabbi Dan, for inviting me. I hope you'll invite me back someday.
Oh,
Thank
we would
you,
love it.
Rabbi Zaslow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Toda rabba.
This was very interesting and
Thank you, Frida. Rabbi Jay, great to see you. Jan Court, good to see you.
very safe.
Of course.
All right, Shalom Chaverim.